for showing up tonight and supporting Civic Nebraska over the last 12 years. We're so excited to host the State of Civic Affairs of Nebraska panel this evening, and to come together and to wrap up somewhat of a turbulent and unprecedented year, to put it lightly. This event would not have been possible without the generous support of our sponsors, including PayPal, Allison Armstrong and Mark Scudder, the Rhonda and Howard Hawks Foundation, and Thomson Rogers. So thank you so much for supporting us, and thank you for so much of all of your support over the past 12 years. This year in particular has been a difficult one for all of us, but never before has our mission been more important as to the why of our work more clear. During my time as executive director, I've been honored to be surrounded by exceptional leaders and talented staff who deserve the credit for helping Civic Nebraska not only survive 2020, but also never once stop serving our communities and Nebraskans who count on our services and our programs the most. It's truly humbling to think back to 2008 when Civic Nebraska was founded. I'm awestruck on how our all-volunteer small organization is now thriving as a nonprofit organization spanning the state of Nebraska and home to a staff of 37 full-time staff and 80 part-time staff. It's not just the size or the scope of our organization that makes me excited to wake up and to come to work with all of you each day, but rather our values of community, innovation, learning, power, and optimism that ignites this organization to create a more modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans. Some of you may know this already, but for the folks that are just getting to know us, Civic Nebraska accomplishes our mission through 3 core programs. First, our youth civic leadership programs. In this spirit of service learning and civic education, our programs serve thousands of Nebraska youth and students each year in our before and after school programs, clubs, and summer programs. At the center of these programs are young Nebraskans potential solutions, taking meaningful action through service learning. The youth civic leadership staff have not missed a step this year. And even in the wake of the pandemic, spearheaded PPE family kit deliveries and education initiatives to keep extended learning opportunities available to students, irrespective of the school closures. We want to thank all of our after-school staff for truly an amazing effort this past year. Second, we build democracy with our civic health programs. These initiatives work with adults and young Nebraskans alike through community asset mapping, neighborhood leadership and advocacy programs, and other unique partnerships with the university, rural high schools, and partnerships with their local organizations and communities and community groups. Most notably, our work this year provided key mutual aid to Nebraskans affected by the pandemic, spurring social connectedness and engagement in spite of social distancing. We have also worked hard to successfully move our civic health trainings online. I'd like to thank all the staff working in those programs as well. And finally, but not last and not least, is our third program, which is our voting rights program. Once Nebraskans are excited and civically engaged in their community, we ensure that their elections are nonpartisan, accessible, and modern. We achieve this through nonpartisan voting rights, policy advocacy, election observation, research, and community education and outreach. A modern, robust democracy cannot exist unless all of its residents and community members are counted and represented. Even though COVID changed how we vote in 2020, Civic Nebraska's voting rights team and partners around the state organized to make sure voters knew how to safely cast a ballot this year, resulting in record high turnout and vote by mail utilization. We are eager to keep this voter-centric momentum going into the 2021 new year. This organizational overview, however, would not be complete without spotlighting the incredible work completed by our Nebraska Counts team. When we started, what started as a special program transformed into a comprehensive statewide initiative that connected with tens of thousands of Nebraskans and powerfully impacted the outcome of the 2020 US Census in Nebraska. The state ended up being fourth in the nation in terms of completion of the census. Heather Ingdahl, her team, and dozens of other partner organizations came together this year to make sure that even the hardest to count census tracts of Nebraska were represented in the next decade. Civic Nebraska will continue to work hard every single day to create a more modern, robust democracy for all Nebraskans. But it's important to remember that a strong democracy cannot create itself. And I can't think of a better group of people to explore this topic tonight on not only the state of civic affairs, but what is the future. And without any further ado, I'm excited to welcome Daniel Bennett, who's our Rural Civic Health Programs Manager, and most importantly tonight, our panel facilitator this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to Daniel.
All right, thanks a lot, Adam. Hello, everybody. I'm happy to be joining you this evening from beautiful, snowy Scotts Bluff. And to all of our panelists, I'm grateful for the opportunity to moderate this conversation with you. So for those of you watching, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. First, we have our very own Amanda Barker, Deputy Executive Director of Civic Nebraska. Amanda oversees our civic health programs and also the Civic Health Index. Jeff Cole is the Vice President at Nebraska Children and Families Foundation and oversees Beyond School Bells, which builds partnerships to grow high quality extended learning opportunities or after school programs across the state. EBONY MCKIVER is also joining us. EBONY is the Social Studies Education Specialist with Nebraska Department of Education. Welcome, EBONY. And last but not least, my colleague Weston Miller is the Director of Public Policy at Civic Nebraska and will provide important insights from his policy perspective and working closely with the unicameral. So thanks all for being with us. So panelists, as Adam mentioned, this has been a challenging year. The loss and fracturing we've seen as a nation and in our homes is on all of our minds and undoubtedly colors how Nebraskans perceive the state of civic affairs today. But the challenges of this year have also shown us response and innovation in civic life that is cause for optimism. And so you four are immersed in both the challenges facing us in civic life and the reasons for optimism. And so we'll start out with each of you just taking a few minutes to share your unique perspective on the state of civic affairs in your work before we move to a more open discussion and field some questions from people watching. So I think we'll actually start with Weston. I'd like to start with you if you could share your perspective as we analyze the November election and what you're seeing in the world of policy. What's the state of civic affairs from your perspective?
Absolutely. Thanks, Daniel. So certainly voter turnout is only one component of the state of civic affairs in Nebraska, but when it comes to the 2020 elections, Nebraska has a lot to be proud of. Our turnout was high, our incidents of concern were low, and most importantly, we have a lot of opportunities to build on the momentum that was generated, frankly, by Nebraskans' insistence on voting despite a chaotic 2020. There were, of course, antagonists in the background who seek to undermine kind of the core assumption of our democracy, which is trust in the results. But despite that, my job and Civic Nebraska's job from a policy perspective is to stay focused on one single question. And that question is our election system working as well as it could? Now, I wasn't kidding when I said Nebraska has a lot to be proud of, but of course there's areas to improve. And at Civic Nebraska, we think there are kind of two main categories of improvement that we tend to focus on. Those two categories are, one, the efficiency of the system itself, but number two, of course, barriers to participation in that system. And I would always be delighted to talk with anyone on this call about specifics of those policy mechanics, but to give you a kind of an overview of what to expect in 2021. And this comes really from our observation of a year in which Nebraska early voting saw a massive, unexpected scale. Nebraskans previously have voted early at about a 25% rate, and we have absolutely destroyed that record, as we have with voter turnout in general. We saw an election with 76% turnout, which is something we should really be proud of. We have several counties that turned out nearly 90% of their registered voters, so really a lot to celebrate. When it comes to improving the efficiency of our system, of course, early voting is going to be a major focus given what we've just experienced this year. So there are four things that we're hoping to accomplish. The first thing we need to focus on, and I think our most urgent area of concern, is ballot tracking. A lot of Nebraskans have voted by mail or voted early for the first time in 2020, And they now have a new question, which they don't have with in-person voting, which is, where is my ballot? People need to be able to know at all stages of the process where their ballot goes. Luckily, this is a problem we can very easily and very affordably solve as a state. There are a number of programs that exist that utilize USPS smart tracking technology to let voters voluntarily sign up and receive alerts on their phone or via email, so you can know when your ballot is mailed to you, when it arrives, when it's received back, and most importantly, when it's counted. This is a really efficient way to improve transparency, to improve security, and just overall improve Nebraskans' confidence in the system. We also want to advocate for online vote by mail or early ballot requests. This is very common. Nearly half the states in our country have an online option for requesting mail ballots. This is a system that is not as efficient in Nebraska as it could be, and we think that this is an important change to make. We have the technology, which we know because we have online voter registration, and we'd like to expand that and make that include online ballot requests. We also think there should be paid postage for early ballots. This problem became exceedingly clear in 2020 with COVID. Now, can most people on this Skype call or on the Zoom call probably find a way to get a stamp to mail their ballot? Of course. But a great election system is not one that operates based on what most people can probably do. It's one that provides a really consistent, accessible system for every voter. And it's just a fact that there were some people quarantined in their house because of COVID, especially for the primary election, who realized they didn't have stamps in their house. And our system needs to account for those folks as well. The last thing on efficiency is we would really like to reduce our state's reliance on provisional ballots. We need to do that by allowing registered voters to update or affirm their registration on election day. There's no reason that we can't improve that process, as many of our neighbors, including Iowa and Wyoming, have done. But as always, even the most efficient election system is only great if it's really accessible. And I think the biggest barrier to accessibility in Nebraska comes to Nebraskans who have served a felony sentence. Nebraska has some of the more archaic felony disenfranchisement laws in the country, and it's a system that we really need to improve. As an organization, we think that if you've served your time, you should be able to vote, and that's really, really simple. We don't see a reason why someone's criminal record should affect their ability to participate in their democracy, because we don't think we should have tiered citizenship. And if you mess with voting rights, that's what you have to do. So to summarize, again, in 2020, we have so much to be proud of in terms of our election system. Our turnout was very high. Some of our counties were in the highest turnout counties among the whole country. But of course, there are improvements that can be made. We're in such a unique time, again, because of the rapid scaling of our vote by mail system. But I think that if we as a state can focus on both improving the efficiency of our system and reducing barriers to participation, we can have some of the best election systems in the whole country.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot, Weston. Next, we'll go to our Deputy Executive Director at Civic Nebraska, Amanda Barker. So Amanda, what do you see in the realm of civic health, sort of the day-to-day neighborhood level actions of involvement and connection? What challenges and opportunities do you see for us this time?
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks for setting us up so optimistically, Weston. It's hard to beat that. What great turnout numbers. The question, what do we see in the state of civic health? I'm going to take maybe 1 minute or even 30 seconds if I'm quick enough to give folks just a quick primer on civic health. The definition of civic health, if you're not familiar with it, is simply, in summary, the measure of a community's civic well-being. So it's oftentimes how individuals and groups are represented in their communities, and also how they kind of organize to define and address issues. So it's certainly a concept that I think bears a lot of witness to what's happened this year, how we not only vote and are politically involved, but it also involves indicators like social connectedness, how we as community members and neighbors connect with one another. Confidence in institutions as another marker of civic health. And again, that's been a pretty big year for confidence in institutions. We also see it in community engagement, maybe those day-to-day activities like volunteering or attending a meeting about public affairs. And then, of course, as I mentioned, political involvement. So voting, registering to vote, but even things like having a discussion about politics with family or friends, or even buying or boycotting, essentially voting with your dollar. So those are some of the day-to-day activities that build up civic health, and I'm excited to dive a little bit into what we've seen in 2020 and perhaps what we can expect to see in 2021. So according to the forthcoming Civic Health Index that Civic Nebraska will be published here in January, there are a couple of top line themes, and I apologize, I'm boiling down like a 35-page document or 35-page report into a couple of minutes, so I'm certainly not getting all the nuances, but Nebraskans are pretty good at spending time with one another, their family, their friends, their neighbors, even despite a pandemic that has forced us mostly to stay within our households. However, we are not particularly good about spending time with people who have a different background than us. The data does show that younger people are better at spending time with people who are different than them. So something we can certainly look to as we find our way into making sure that we're experiencing the whole diversity of the human race. Nebraskans are also great at volunteering and working with peers at achieving positive change. We see a cause, we rally behind it, we give our time and our talent to that cause. I would say from the data, it looks like community engagement and volunteering leading the way is by far our best indicator as a state. We're willing to put our time and energy where it really matters. And Nebraskans, I would also say, are getting more comfortable with engaging in political behaviors. Those certainly weren't our highest scores by any means, but there was significant increase from the last time we did this report in 2015 to today. So those sorts of things that we're getting more comfortable with as Nebraskans are discussing politics, contacting public officials, and of course buying and boycotting items as well, or products. So those are sorts of three kind of top line takeaways for Nebraskans in our civic health. And as I thought about optimistically what we can look to do in 2021 and beyond to improve civic health, Nebraskans can first and foremost, if you only take one thing away from what I share tonight, it is this: start local. And I think that's perhaps the most optimistic thing I could say. Amongst your friends and your neighbors, as you can, the real change happens where you are. So again, start local. That's one thing you can't do. Nebraskans beyond that can create and sustain some social infrastructures. And again, I know that I'm saying this in the midst of a pandemic, and you might say, hey, Amanda, yeah, I've had enough Zoom meetings. But as we can gather, whether that's virtually and in person, perhaps in the coming months, build with intention that social infrastructure that allows you to connect with people of all kinds of backgrounds. Don't let it be an afterthought. Social connectedness is of critical importance in civic health of communities. Nebraskans can also adapt to new forms of community engagement. And I think that has been made very clear this year. There are certainly ways for our institutions to be more accessible in 2020 and beyond, now that we've seen that we've had to make adaptations. So I would also say invite emerging leaders to the table as well. And that can be formal or informal, but the folks who want to make a difference, invite them to the table and to your efforts. And then finally, practice civil discourse and deepen your media literacy skills. We've seen that, and if you've paid attention to kind of political rhetoric at all over the last year, the ability to come together to discuss hard things, but to do so with respect and out of a desire to deepen your understanding is going to be the best path forward for our democracy. So if you're at all intrigued by this data, for sure pay attention to Civic Nebraska as we release our Civic Health Index in January here. But beyond that, again, don't forget to start local.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Amanda. some interesting setup from both policy and civic health perspective. We've had a couple of questions in the chat. Please keep those coming. We're going to have a time to be able to do some question and answer after we get through our next two panelists. So please keep those questions coming, and we'll try to get to those when we can. So next, I'd like to invite EBONY MCKIVER. EBONY, this is our first time meeting, but reading up on you online, I gathered that you were also a high school social studies teacher for quite a while. So using, I guess, your perspective on both of your hats as a teacher and as a social studies specialist for Department of Education, what are you seeing at this time, and what do you think opportunities and challenges are from your perspective?
Absolutely. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Civic Nebraska, for the opportunity to be a part of the panel discussion today. So I would say that the role of education and civic affairs is the educators are really on the front line of developing and creating an engaged citizenry. And so I would like to say a couple things about that in terms of I'm hopeful about where education is leading civics, and I'm also I think we're making a lot of progress. And so in making progress, I think we're creating critical and engaged students. And those critical and engaged students are able to think about things in terms of challenging those conventional norms. I know earlier Weston talked about the felony disenfranchisement. And so we have students coming out of high school who are able to challenge those outdated policies. And I know that recently with our last election, we had the Amendment 1, which talked about removing language from the Nebraska Constitution about slavery and indentured servitude and using that as punishment for a crime. And so I'm excited that we had over 600,000 Nebraskans vote for the amendment, and it passed, but we also had over 250,000 Nebraskans who voted against it. And for whatever reason, you know, that's something that we'll be able to discuss in our classrooms and take with us, but it shows that we have a lot of work to do in some ways. I also like to talk about working for the Nebraska Department of Education and how we're focusing on equity. And there's a big push by Commissioner Bloomstead around this idea of equity in education. And as a social studies educator, I've made sure that we've included resources on the social studies webpage on equity and anti-racism and how that also benefits our students as well. And so when we look at the research from Gloria Ladson Billings and Geneva Gay and a whole host of other people, we know that multiculturalism in education is beneficial for our students because it just promotes better citizenship. It promotes those relationships that Amanda was talking about earlier, when Nebraskans need to do better at connecting with people from different backgrounds. And so we have some legislation in revised statute 79-724 that actually nods towards that. And so 79-724 does two things that I think are really important. And the first thing, again, it really forces the school's hand in developing and implementing multiculturalism in education and through social studies education. And so in implementing that multiculturalism in education, we're not just talking about race, even though race is a large factor when we talk about multiculturalism, but we're also talking about students from different sexual orientations, or we're talking about students from different religious backgrounds or different socioeconomic backgrounds. We're talking about students that are in special education and even gifted and talented. And again, we're learning how to embrace students from all different backgrounds, and eventually we'll be able to embrace all citizens in Nebraska residents from all different backgrounds. The second and the biggest piece, I think, comes from this revision of State Statute 79-724 is also requiring students to do one of three things before they graduate. The first thing that students can do is they can create a project around a person or an event related to one of our national or federal holidays. The second thing that they can do is that they can take the USCIS naturalization test in its entirety and they can pass it. But really the third thing that they can do, and I think, again, this is really the most important thing, with this revised statute of 79-724 is students have the ability to participate in a public meeting. And from their participation in a public meeting, they are able to again create a project or write a paper about that participation. However, we're now encouraging students to be a part of the civic atmosphere. We're asking them to be engaged in what's happening in their local communities, in their local and government. And that's really important to creating a well-educated citizen for Nebraska and for the nation. And then when we look nationally at what's happening in civic education, we see that it's passed the House of Representatives, but on December the 2nd, we had the Educating for Democracy Act, excuse me. And the Educating for Democracy Act is going to provide, if passed, $1 billion towards civic education. And that is going to help different states with implementing civics education as well. And so what that says to me is, since 2002, we've seen this real marginalization of social studies. And there is a study that was produced by CCSSO, which shows that since 2002, over 40% of school districts have admitted to reducing the time spent in social studies in order to focus on other subject areas like math and ELA, because those are tested areas. Well, now we can see that people are really investing in understanding the importance of giving foundational knowledge to social studies and how that impacts and benefits students. So that $1 million will not only impact states, but it will also have students take a civic readiness test almost to see and to make sure that our students are graduating high school civically aware. But the other thing, again, like I said, it shows is that we're understanding the importance of civics education with students. And so if you've heard of the baseball study before, it shows that when a student who really knows about baseball is apt to perform better on a literacy test just because they know more about baseball. Well, it's the same thing with civics. And studies show that students will actually perform better on literacy tests if they have a strong foundational knowledge in civics education. So I think this is really important as well. And so I think the last thing, as we kind of discuss, is like what has happened in the last year with COVID and its effect on social studies and civics. And I will say, as a civics educator for 13, 14 years, one of the things that I loved about teaching civics, and I loved about teaching history and just social studies and period, is the tangible things. Like, we love holding on to books, and we love bringing artifacts into class and giving students that real connection. Well, that's kind of delayed, I would say, our work in transferring into the technological sphere with social studies education. And so we saw with COVID that there was this real need for social studies education to really translate into technology. And so as we've made that transition, we've seen that there's been a bit of a struggle initially, but also we've seen that from March, with the initial closing of schools, that social studies education has really grown by leaps and bounds when we talk about technology. And in some of those ways are accessing government documents. In some of those ways, we have students now participating in civics, again, in public meetings. We have access to newspapers and magazines, and it's just really been great because now we can encourage our students to do more inquiry-based learning when they're talking about civics. And what does that mean? We can ask our students questions like, can words lead to war? And then we ask our students to really do some research-based and find supporting evidence and to contextualize and to corroborate all these statements that they're finding to be able to present a well-refined argument in the classroom. And this can be done as early as first and second grade, that we can ask our students to really create these civics-based arguments. But at the end of the day, what happens is when we have these students engaged in inquiry processes, they come out of school, out of high school, one, able to make connections from the civics classroom to the real world, but two, they also come with a set of skills, again, and I mentioned words like corroborating, contextualizing, research, support with evidence, and they know how to use those skills in their real lives as they begin their college and career. And so what we're really doing is we're creating civically engaged students as soon and even before they walk out of those high school doors. And I say that's what we really want when we're talking about how education can help produce citizens and residents for Nebraska that are really prepared to engage in civics.
Right. Thank you so much, Ebony. That was a lot of really great information and a lot that I know myself and the people on this call are interested in following up on. So, so thanks for that. As a great follow-up to what Ebony just shared, Jeff Cole, I'd like to invite you to speak next. And I think the after-school space or extended learning opportunity space is a really great follow-up to that. So what are you seeing from your perspective and the effect of the times that we've been through and the way that things are changing that you're responding?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. And yeah, that was a great setup, having me follow Ebony. That's a great overview to what's going on inside the school day. And, you know, what we focus on at Beyond School Bells is the learning that takes place after the end of the school day and after the end of the school year. You know, we know that learning never stops and that we need to be as intentional about these expanded learning opportunities, what we call them, and during the after school and summer months as we are during the in-classroom moments. And, you know, we're blessed in Nebraska to have a high quality public education system that we can build on. And so we really kind of view it as a passing of the baton between the school day staff and all the great learning that can take place during the out of school time space, especially around civic education, examples of going to public meetings and participating in community dialogue are things that are really built for after school and summer. So excited to be a part of the conversation. Just briefly, before I jump into the Nebraska specific stuff, I shared on the chat a link to a recent report that came out from our national partners at the After School Alliance called America After 3. This is a once every 4-year report that they put out that really captures the state of after school program in the United States. So they do a great kind of macro level job painting the picture, and then they really do distill at the state level how after school and summer programs are doing on a state-by-state basis. So I'll just jump in real quickly and frame some of my comments with a recognition of what After School After 3 found at in Nebraska. And so, you know, the first piece is that the demand is high. For every young person in an after-school program in Nebraska, 4 more young Nebraskans would enroll if 1 were available and affordable and accessible in their communities. Those are very important distinctions because that is not the case. And parents tell us that the programs are increasingly expensive and they're not able to find things within their price point that they can enroll their children in their community. So that's a big concern of ours, because when kids get in these programs, our research shows that they're very happy with the programs. Their parents are very happy with the programs. Nebraska ranks among the very highest in the nation in terms of parental satisfaction with after school programs. And they do it on a number of different benefits. You know, they really recognize that after school is keeping their children safe and out of trouble, but they're also getting important supports. So the things like team building and project-based learning, those are things that take place in after-school programs, and parents recognize that that's really valuable for young people. Learning really important life skills, like civic participation, is an important quality that parents value in after-school programs. But really, ultimately, the challenge is around lack of access. We really just don't have enough high-quality programs for all Nebraskans who want to participate. And, you know, it's a shame because the research shows that parents overwhelmingly think that these kinds of programs should be available to all youth. And again, Nebraska was among the very highest in the nation at 92% of parent respondents saying that they believe that some form of public support should be made available so that we can grow these programs. So, you know, it's a best of times, worst of times story. You know, in Nebraska, we wish we had more. Those who are in programs really like them, but we need more of them. So that's going to be our work moving forward. Focusing on the civics piece, you know, we think, as I mentioned previously, that after school is just an ideal platform. And we have examples of that from Civic Nebraska and other organizations that are operating in the after school space. It's a great place for young people to get experience with service learning projects. And in fact, Civic Nebraska, we just provided a grant to support the development of what we're calling a center of excellence around service learning, where opportunities to integrate activities going on with the school day and after school service learning will really be documented and shared across the state. So, you know, COVID-19 has been a huge challenge for everybody, and after school is certainly no exception to that. But we do feel optimistic. You know, some of the things that Ebony mentioned, the people's willingness to go online and to, you know, dip their toe in the vast resources that are available online to promote independent learning is, you know, never before have as many people been taking advantage of that. And we think we can intentionally build on that in the future and help create, you know, a dynamic environment in Nebraska's after-school programs. Our goal really is to support programs that will be the envy of every other state in the country, and think, you know, building on our record high turnout in in voting this year, we can be a record high state in terms of providing the best available after school and summer programs, so that, you know, we can get to the job of creating learners in Nebraska that are really prepared for, you know, an ever-changing environment. So really excited about the future, you know, understanding of today's challenges, but look forward to the opportunities over the 2021 year.
Great, thanks a lot, Jeff, and thanks to all our panelists for your brief overviews. I have some prepared questions, and then we'll also get to the questions that are rolling into the chat. Those of you who, if you have a question on your mind, feel free to please place your questions into the chat, and we'll try to get to them. The first question I have, though, is not one that I actually prepared, but I just thought of it while you all were talking, of the many ways that we're adapting to COVID-19 and to new ways of engagement. And I wanted to ask a question about the staying power of some of these changes. What things are maybe worth keeping that are going to stick around, do you think? What things maybe are worth keeping that you think we might have to fight for? And what are we going to have to fight to get back? If any of you have any thoughts on what might be sticking around and how things, and what has maybe been positive that we'd like to keep.
I can jump in and kind of build on the comments I was just making and answering the question about communities that do after-school programs. One of the best sources for support for after-school program is the 21st Century Community Learning Center grant. I'll put a link in the chat for that resource. And it has the potential, I think, it has a network across the state of challenging educational environments that need additional support where grants are made. I think there's an opportunity in some of there's some conversation around future CARES Act bills that will provide more funding for this funding source, so that more children attending schools that have a high percentage of low-income kids will have access to the kind of programs that we know make a difference in their lives. So very excited about that. Hopefully we'll see some action in the new Congress to provide more funding for that important strand.
So my comment would be, I'm excited that it's really, that COVID has, I guess, created ways for us to access and for students to access information via the internet. I think the problem, though, that comes with it inherently is, are we equitable in the ways that we have our students accessing that information? And so, you know, I'm not from Nebraska, so I am a new transplant, excuse me. And so it was kind of shocking to me to come to Nebraska and find out that there are still areas in Nebraska where our students and families, period, are still like using dial-up to even access the internet. And so what are we doing, I guess, in the long term to make sure that we're being equitable to our rural families and our low-income families and communities, to not only make sure that they're able to access this information using the internet, but also in the materials and computers and things that they need to be, you know, moving towards 21st century education in the way that we really want our students to move in that way.
Yeah, thanks. That's great insight. And Weston, I want to go to you next. Actually, if you have any idea, you know, I think there might be some reaction to, especially I think prevalent has been to mail-in voting, that we might be potentially seeing some reaction policy. What kind of reactions to this previous election and how we've had to adapt with COVID? What do you see?
Yeah, great question. So based on your first question, our expansion of early voting is both something worth keeping, but also something we're going to have to fight to keep, I think. As I mentioned earlier, Nebraska saw a rapid and serious scaling of our early voting, not only in the number of participants, but also in the emphasis that the state placed on a particular method of voting. In 2020, because of COVID, the state was very straightforward about encouraging people to adopt a particular method of voting. And that had a really serious impact, not just on the number of folks who voted by mail, but the number of folks who voted, period, because the state was really placing an emphasis on the importance of safely and efficiently turning out Nebraskans to vote. And there's just no substitute for that. Now, there are a couple specific policy choices that we made that improved those outcomes. Most of the structural efficiencies I mentioned earlier, the primary goal really is just to sustain that momentum that we established in 2020 when it comes to early voting. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that any new change comes with critics, and some of the critics of tools that increase voter turnout can be especially nasty and especially malicious. So with an increase in voter turnout as a result of a quote unquote new method of voting, even though it's not new at all, it's just more popular now, we have seen an absolute spike in sort of mindless rhetoric about voter fraud and stolen elections and just all the nasty political talking points every time we try a new strategy to increase turnout. So combating those talking points, it takes vigilance, it takes serious effort, but it also takes a lot of focus, and it requires, I think, organizations like ours to just stay razor focused on our goal, which is to improve the structures themselves. But it also, this is a great example of how all of these panelists here, all of our issues are incredibly connected, because we can't effectively advocate for tools to increase turnout unless we're appropriately educating folks about media literacy or why voting is important in the first place, and encouraging and providing students with the resources that they need to receive that education. So I'm hopeful we can build on this momentum, but it's going to take vigilance, and the political blowback from the tool is something worth fighting for sure.
Great, thanks, Weston. The next question, I'd like to draw a little bit on a question that was posed by Wes Jensen about what can one do to provide opportunities for more Nebraskans to interact with those they differ with. And this, I'll mention also, echoes some of the feedback that Civic Nebraska has gotten as we're doing our strategic planning, and also to the statistic that Amanda mentioned, in people, Nebraskans, especially rural and older Nebraskans, maybe not having as much opportunity to spend time with people of different backgrounds. So from each of your perspectives, what is being done and what can be done to build some of those bridges with people of different backgrounds? Go ahead.
Sorry, Daniel. I was gonna say, I'll jump in first, Wes, because it's a great question, and I've been thinking on it since you typed it into the chat feature. I don't think there's any one-size-fits-all response here, and I know that my fellow panelists will have great insight here as well. I'm sure they'll say, volunteer at an after-school program, because you're going to meet a lot of unique people. But I think the answer in part lies in a couple of different places, and I mentioned these two phrases in my prepared remarks. And that is, one, I think it's easier to meet people when you're out and about in the community, right? So any form of community engagement, like volunteering. I know I volunteer weekly at a space, and I meet people I never would have met in Lincoln had it not been for this volunteer opportunity. So putting yourself in a position to serve others likely will allow you to, in some capacity, will likely allow you to meet people who are different from you. So I think that's one key way to do it. And then another part of doing that is to invite those emerging leaders. So if you're leading an effort to expand on a cause, thinking about and kind of taking almost like a civic asset map of your community, and thinking not just from your own perspective, who would maybe make sense to invite to the table, but think about the groups or the population of people that you maybe haven't heard from on issues, the issue that you're caring about or the cause that you're trying to move forward, and make sure to invite those emerging leaders as well. Those would be just two almost perspective shifts as you think about helping folks meet people of different backgrounds.
Sure, thanks, Amanda. And to get a little bit more specific about this, among 2020's many challenges, one prominent one was a reckoning with the racial injustice seemed to be brought front and center. And so I guess the question to remaining panelists, so what's being done or what can we expect in each of your areas in response to both the, personally the pain or the pain of this year's events and also the renewed urgency to address institutional racial injustice in 2020. What can we expect and what do you see as should be done?
So I guess I'll jump in there and say there are a couple of things being done in the, the social studies education realm with NDE. And again, I'll say that there are resources that we have sort of curated around anti-racism and equity that are available and that we make sure that we send out to educators across the state. But I will speak for me personally, it's about being in spaces that you normally wouldn't have been in. And so COVID has kind of prevented that for me this year, but I'm looking forward to being able to travel to the Panhandle and other places in Nebraska where maybe they don't see a lot of Ebonies. And when Ebony gets there, Ebony wants to be able to sit down and have conversations, and honest conversations, because the other side of it is there can never be change if people aren't willing to be honest about how they feel and the state of what's going on in not only Nebraska and nationally. And so I think that if I can sit down and have a heart-to-heart with 1, 2, 5, 10 people, that's a start somewhere. And so I'm really grateful that I'm in this position to be able to really travel around the state and start the conversation in this sphere of civics affairs in this moment of history.
And
thanks, Ebony.
I might add to the structural side of that too. I think that from a policy perspective, I talked about felony disenfranchisement laws earlier, which are one of the most obvious remnants of they're the policies in Nebraska that have the most blatantly racist roots, is the only way to say it. And I think that part of our policy advocacy has to involve being honest about the history of our state and of our country. And that has to be attacked, of course, on both the individual and the structural level. But I think that one of our barriers to having that conversation with the legislature, for example, is that our 49 lawmakers don't show up to work saying like, this is a racist policy and I like it. That's not how they're thinking. They're thinking, this is a policy that I'm used to and it makes sense. What's the problem? And so part of our job, again, a connection between all of these panelists here, the only way to combat that is by accurately educating our students and our adults about the history of our state and how our public policy interweaves with that history. And felony disenfranchisement is it's a huge example of that.
Great, thank you, Eston. Okay, I think we're going to try to wrap in a couple of the comments that another question that we've had. One is, I assume this is specifically for Weston. Are we aware of any court case that is trying to reach the Supreme Court to contest ex-felon or felon disenfranchisement on the premise of that the incarcerated do not lose their citizenship while incarcerated or after?
I wish I had a really optimistic answer to that question. I have an accurate one, but it's not great. So we are not going to solve this problem through the Supreme Court, unfortunately. The court has held at every turn that states do have a constitutional, or do have the right to disenfranchise convicted felons. I've never found the reasoning to be sound, but I'm not a member of the U.S. Supreme Court, so that doesn't matter. The most famous case is called Richardson v. Ramirez in 1974, where the court was crystal clear that states do have a right, and it is constitutional to disenfranchise convicted felons. Unfortunately, that notion was upheld very recently by the Supreme Court when they allowed the state of Florida, and upheld an 11th Circuit order allowing the state of Florida to disenfranchise convicted felons until they had not only completed their sentence, but also paid off what they call all their fines and fees, which is a vague and sometimes insolvable amount of money. So the problem of felony disenfranchisement in the United States is solvable. It is not going to be solved through the Supreme Court. The advocacy that we need to be doing is always at the state level, because obviously just because we can do it doesn't mean that we should.
Great, thank you, Weston. I have another question. This is for Ebony McKeever. This question is coming from Jeanette Jones-Bazanski. Mrs. McKeever, how open is 79724 to mandating the teaching of the history of the indigenous people, both original and forcefully relocated, in the curriculum? The comment is, I ask because I teach at UNL, where I'm surprised about how little some Nebraskans know about this history.
Yes, so it is actually very open to teaching about the indigenous population and even those forcefully moved from the land here. What I will say though is, and I think I said this in the comments, it's almost a field of dreams sort of or thing. Like you have to build it for people to be able to use it and access it. And at this point, there are some good materials out there for educators to use, but it's just not enough. And so I'm currently working with the Nebraska Commission on Indian Affairs to really develop and create some great materials for our educators to be able to use in the classroom, that high quality information that they can access. And so I guess the idea is more or less to be able to flood our databases. You know, we have a standards instructional tool. We have the Nebraska Open Educational Resources website, and we can put those resources there for educators to be able to access. So it's open to it. It's just a matter of being able to develop it and have those available for our educators to be able to use and access.
Thank you. Continuing to follow up on that, on the idea of what of these civic leaders of the future for education, both in school and in the extended learning space. So I guess this would be a question for Ebony and Jeff. What does the civic leader of the future look like? As you think of students who are going to be graduating from high school this year and be stepping out of the place where they live or high school, all the way to our kindergartners who are going to be growing up to be civic leaders of the next generation. What skills and mindsets and habits do you see as being most essential for our civic leaders going forward from this year?
I can start off. These guys are going to be incredibly empowered with technological tools that the current generation can't even imagine. So I do think there is a glass half full, scenario coming out of their deep immersion in online learning that's just happened. These young folks are going to be really, really capable of using and inventing a whole suite of tools to galvanize their peers around issues that they care about. So I'm super excited about that. I think they'll need to have, really good communication and negotiation skills, because the challenges that they face are not easy. We've not left them a good table, but they, I think, will have tools that we can't imagine today that they're going to have to utilize to solve those challenges. And we've talked a lot about them today, but I do think the mindset needs to be around innovative problem solvers. The solutions to yesterday's problems won't solve the problems of tomorrow's generation. And we'll need people who have an innovative mindset that we think we can help develop through high quality education and after school programs so that they come at new challenges with a fresh perspective. So excited about passing the torch on to a new generation that has a better skill set than sadly we've been proven to have ourselves.
And I will say, and again, I think you all have heard me use these words before in this conversation, but I'm really excited for the implementation of inquiry learning within civics education, and for those very reasons that Jeff kind of talked about. Because inquiry learning, one, it teaches our students to ask questions. And then not does it only not only does it help our students with teaching them to ask questions, but it also helps our students develop skills like research. And we talk about media literacy and being able to distinguish what good evidence is when we look into the internet. But it also teaches corroboration and contextualization. It teaches our students to be able to understand biases. And I'll also throw out there too, like, I don't necessarily think that quote unquote fake news is necessarily a bad thing when we're working with our students in developing what a good civic leader looks like. And the reason why is because our students need to be able to discern what is good information and from what is bad information. And they can't do that if they don't see what bad information looks like. So not only are we teaching those skills through inquiry learning, but we're also teaching our students the last kind of sort of the important piece to this is a call to action. And so when our students leave school, in order to have somebody that we think is a good civic leader or just someone who is fully engaged in the civic process, we want them to be able to find a need in their community, in their state, and say, how can I fulfill this need? What can I do to fix it? And so I think these are all skills that we're looking to really push forward in our schools and give our students what they need to be successful.
Great, thanks both. I think that's a good segue into the topic of misinformation. It's hard to think of a more pressing topic, at least that's on my mind at this time. I've heard the press referred to as the immune system of democracy before, and it seems like in our strategic planning process as well that we're going through at the time, misinformation is of particular concern for Nebraskans and probably people across the country. So I would ask for your insight as to, what does maybe the data say about trust in information sources or trust in institutions, and what can be done in each of your areas of expertise to prevent the spread of misinformation, to mitigate the situation that we're in going forward and help people to discern the truth.
So I'll say very quickly, one of the things that we can do in the education realm is, I believe it was put in the chat by Rob, but Rob shared SHEG, which is Stanford History Education Group. They have another website, which is, why can't I think of the name right now? CORE. I can't think of it. But anyway, the primary purpose of CORE is really to help our students with understanding misinformation and how to tell the differences between, again, good information and bad information, and what you can do with that bad information. It helps our students discern from everything from articles to even images. What are those video fakes where they make people appear to be speaking and saying things that they're not really. So from my perspective, again, it's about making sure that we utilize our open education resources that are available to really promote civic engagement, media literacy, and helping our students with understanding this information.
Great, thanks. Amanda, do you happen to have any updated information on that confidence in institutions or confidence in news sources from the index?
Yes, and in fact, I was just pulling it up as you asked that question, so thank you, Daniel. So the current population survey, which is where we draw our data from for the Civic Health Index, didn't ask the questions in the most recent round of the survey, but we were able to pull from a couple of other sources that actually give us an indication of how people feel about the institution known as the media. And one of those surveys is actually one we were excited to wrap in for the first time in the Civic Health Index, which is the Nebraska Rural Poll. So of course, we're only looking at non-metro folks, but still gives us a real good read, at least in some local data about how people feel about the media. And one of the themes that came away from it is that local media, so local TV, local newspapers, news sources vetted by family, friends, and acquaintances. Those are, they rank some of the, they rank the highest in terms of media sources and trust in media sources, which really suggests that those local institutions have a high degree of confidence, right? And should be a conduit for some of those kind of urgent public problems that we look at. So yeah, thank you, Heidi, for dropping that in the chat. That's perfect. So I find that to be interesting when people perhaps can be a little bit closer to the source or the folks that are producing the news, they have a higher amount of confidence in them. In terms of, I'm looking at some Gallup stuff too. Newspapers broadly, from a Gallup poll done in June 2020, that had less of a confidential kind of statement there. Truly, I'm looking over here at a chart, so I'm sorry. Yeah, and then television news was even lower. Television news ranked just above Congress, which is the lowest of all those surveyed. So definitely, I think the takeaway here would be local news, whether that's newspapers or TV, has the highest amount of confidence.
Sure, thanks. I think we're going to go to another question from the chat. This is a question from Lori Brody, and it's for Amanda. If you can tell from your research if liberals feel as comfortable talking about politics as conservatives are in Nebraska.
Sure, good question, Lori. At this point, again, with the current population survey data, they didn't give us a breakdown between political ideologies, but they did give us a breakdown for geography and for educational attainment. And so to underscore the importance of Ebony's work and Jeff's work in their various networks, the higher educational attainment that respondents had, the more willing they were to engage in political discourse with friends, family, and neighbors. So that's a good predicator. In order to prepare future citizens or residents, neighbors, we ought to be helping support them in their educational efforts as well. And those educational efforts really should be predicated on some of the things like civic online reasoning, media literacy, and how to have a conversation that's difficult. So that's an important one to note. And the other thing, probably maybe less informative, but certainly just good to know, in Nebraska anyway, the non-metro population that reported that they frequently engage in conversation, political-based conversation, was 33%, whereas metro area folks were a little bit more willing to frequently engage in those political conversations, coming in at 44%. So not to get too into the numbers, but perhaps in a rural setting, when you are known, or it's just a smaller setting, less people, word travels quicker, perhaps there's a little more reluctance to enter into those tougher conversations, but all the same,
Sure.
The work is being done, so.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I want to stick with our political discourse conversation here, and this is actually going to be a question for Weston, since you work with the unicameral so closely. One of the concerns that continues to come up that's on people's minds is political division and polarization. And it seems like it's something that we all want to be less divided and we all want to be less polarized. And yet it also at the same time seems like we keep electing people who are more polarizing, or we increasingly see that that coming together not happening in our elected bodies. So what would you say is the outlook for this maybe incongruent desire of people to not be as divided, and some of the trends that it seems like we see in our elected bodies?
That is an enormous question, Daniel. I will take up the remaining 3 hours to answer this question. Wow. So I'm gonna just try to at least tackle this at the state level. So yeah, the dissonance is shocking that you just identified, that everyone says that political vitriol is bad, polarization is bad, and yet we keep electing people that further and further those divides. I mean, I'm not exaggerating when I say there's like 1,000 studyable components to this. And I know I've said this in my last like 3 answers, but this truly is another example of how all 4 of these panelists, like our subject areas, are so completely connected. Being able to even discern the difference between what I think I want out of my life and how that translates into me casting my vote at the ballot box, like that requires really serious education, both in and out of school. It also requires a really healthy, or it depends on the level of our connection to our neighbors and to our communities. Our perception of whether we are a community insider or a community outcast has tremendous impact on how we vote. Our overall level of formal education can have a huge impact on how we vote. But overall, and this is, anything I say here is going to be dramatically oversimplified, so I just want to own that. But at a certain point, especially in a year like 2020, I mean, people are feeling desperate, and it's really a question of what they're feeling desperate about. I think a lot of us are desperate to understand what is the actual role of government in our lives, and how does that contrast with what I want it to be. There's also a question I think for all of us, regardless of age, regardless of geography, of where do I want my life to go, and what role does government play in helping or hindering me as I try to get there. So yeah, it is a vastly complex question, but I guess for the purpose of this panel and for me not taking 4 hours, I'll just say that this is a great illustration of how the notions of education, both in and out of school, the notion of civic health, the notion of voting and public policy, they are all so intimately connected. And maybe part of the problem is that we're taught to think about them as totally separate, which they're just certainly not.
Great, thanks, Weston. Thanks for tackling that. Anybody can join Weston for a fireside chat later. He's willing to give some free advice and information. So, lastly, we have maybe time for one more or some closing statements, I guess, from each of our panelists. And I'd like to sort of bring it back to democracy and the idea that it doesn't come from nothing, that it's certain mindsets and habits and intention that bring it about and allow it to be sustained. I think it's been called like the habits of the heart. What values do we have? So that's the question I would maybe pose to each of you is, what actions and opportunities do you see as being the most pressing and that we can focus our energy in that area where all of our disciplines converge in building a strong democracy?
I can take a shot at it at the beginning. I do, as I said at the last, I think this is a moment where we have the opportunity to be very creative. I think we've seen over the last 9 months that things don't have to always operate as they've always operated. And so I think we have an opportunity and really a responsibility to think about our democratic institutions differently. I would suggest we need to borrow from other countries. Democracy is not an American invention, and it's being practiced around the world with a large degree of success in other places that we should learn mightily from. So I'm excited about the opportunity to rebuild America's democratic institutions based on successes that are proven in other places. This does not need to be built from scratch, but can be built with imagination and borrowing from other places. I think we're at a point where we can make our democratic life in America much, much richer. And from the trends in Nebraska, it seems like we're getting a lot of participation, but it's participation to what end? I think is really important. So I'm excited about the opportunity. I think we have the potential to create a robust democracy that will thrive in the future. We just have to be willing to try new things.
So I'll go along with what Jeff said, and he kind of, stole my thunder or idea. But I think, again, it's this idea of participation. And so when we look at it from the education perspective, it's about having educators that are creating student body or students who have this desire for a call to action. And I will say, like, over the last month or so, we've been reviewing applications for the United States Senate Youth Program. And what has really distinguished the finalists from the rest of the applicants is that they have felt this strong desire for a call to action, to figure out a problem or a need somewhere and be able to fix that problem or need. But one of the things that I also saw in reading over the applications is that this desire for a call to action was not something that was created or developed in schools. And so this has made me sad, because I want to figure out and I want to be able to leverage what it is that we need to be able to implement this and create this in schools and have this fire that's burning in all of our students, that when they graduate from a Nebraska high school, they're ready to tackle the world and, fix problems and be able to introduce legislation. And in some ways we've started that. I just got approved for a grant, yay, that is actually going to work with students in being able to create mock legislation, excuse me. And so that's really what I see is the issue, is that we need to have students leaving school with this desire for a call to action to participate in our government.
Great, thanks. Amanda or Weston, any closing thoughts?
All right, I'll go. Yeah, I think the vein of participation is where I want to go as well. I think that where do we want to focus our energy? I think that Jeff and Ebony have both really eloquently said and are encompass the importance of participation. And to go back to what I said earlier, that level of participation in the classroom, once you've graduated from that classroom, that participation, of course, extends into adulthood. But I think a mistake that, frankly, advocates like me make a lot of the time is we talk about voting as though it is the only function of participation once you're out. So you've turned 18, you're a citizen, you participate if you vote. There's a reason that I'm only 1/4 of the panelists, and that's because voting is not even close to the largest bulk of your time when it comes to healthily engaging in your civic society. However, that is a right that you have, that participation, and it's a right that you should demand. So I guess from a policy perspective, where do I want you to expend your energy for the sake of civic health? I want you to think about yourself not as someone who has to earn your right to vote, but to think of yourself as a crucial piece in this democratic organism. And it should be your elected officials who are trying to earn your vote from you. You are someone who absolutely has the right to demand everything that you need to participate well in our society, and that includes your right to vote. That also includes accountability for your elected officials. I am grateful in many ways that my job at Civic Nebraska doesn't involve elections in terms of the political side. I'm interested in the system, not the candidates. But I think a huge part of civic health is accountability to elected officials. If your elected official tries to make it harder for you to vote, there should be consequences for that. If your elected official tries to keep you from participating, if your elected official lies to you, there should be consequences for all of those things. And you as a citizen, while voting is not all that you do, voting is your tool to enact those consequences. So I hope that you think about your right to vote, not as your only function, but certainly as a very important function that you wield to make sure that your elected officials work for you, not the other way around.
Great. Thanks, Weston. Amanda, just 1 minute before we kick it off to Bree for our closing.
Okay, great. What keeps ringing in my head, Daniel, as you asked that question is that our communities are better when we own them together, right? And so continuing on the participation vein, I think it's important to acknowledge that we need to, in our communities, whatever they may be, whether that's a geographic community or a social community, but own them together. Lift up those around you, serve alongside those around you. Make sure that we're focusing on the assets and the strengths that your community has. And again, lift them up and work towards a better community because we want people to belong. So make your community a place of belonging for other folks. And you'll find belonging there yourself, and you'll find a really strong and civically healthy community as well. So that's what I would say with my last minute.
Great, thanks a lot. And thanks to all of our panelists. Very much I enjoyed the conversation. You've given us a lot to think about and a definite call to action to participate and to keep working collaboratively across our different sectors. So thanks everybody. Big virtual hand to all of our panelists. Well, that's it for our panel discussion. I'm going to kick it off to my coworker, Brianna White, who's the site coordinator at Sherman Elementary. So I'll kick it off to her for our conclusion.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello and good evening. My name is Brianna White, or Miss Bree, which is what my students call me at my after-school program. I have been working at Civic Nebraska since 2018 and the site coordinator at Sherman Elementary for almost 1 year. Being able to reach the community through working with the youth is more than rewarding to me. Students at Sherman inspire me every day. We had a small group of students volunteer with me to upkeep the community garden at the Sherman Community Center over the summer when the center went on furlough during COVID-19. Students actually planted the seeds, watered the plants, and later, when school started, they picked and harvested crops for their family to use for dinner. Hearing the stories of mom making vegetable soup gives me such the warm and fuzzy feeling. It's been an honor to work and see the organization grow to having over 100 full and part-time staff providing impactful programs to thousands of Nebraskans each year. I believe the work I do impacts the future civic state of Nebraska by teaching my students to be confident and caring citizens at a young age. And right now, our mission has never been more important. Despite the turbulence of this year, I know that the impact Civic Nebraska has across all of our programs touches the lives of thousands of Nebraskans each and every year. Just as our panel shared tonight, creating a modern and robust democracy for all Nebraskans is a lot of work, and we need you to be a part of our mission. You will notice in the chat multiple ways to give back to our organization. I'm asking you to make your end of the year donation count by thinking of Civic Nebraska. Donations of $75, $250, or even $1,000 empowers my staff to keep serving youth and families before and after school, even when the districts are physically closed. Thank you so much for being a part of our virtual State of Civic Affairs in Nebraska event. Happy holidays and good night.